We all know the story. It's a picture painted for us in soft autumnal colors from the time we're in kindergarten. Pilgrims with their tall, buckled hats and stoic Native Americans sitting down for a peaceful harvest feast. It's a foundational American image, a story of friendship and gratitude that we've been told our entire lives. But that story is a lie. And it's not just a simple oversimplification. It's a carefully constructed myth designed to hide a much darker and more complicated truth. The real story of Thanksgiving isn't one of peace, but of politics, plague, and a prelude to war. This is the dark history of Thanksgiving that America won't teach you. The version of Thanksgiving taught to most of us centers on one event, a 3-day harvest feast in 1621. We were told the struggling Pilgrims, after surviving their first brutal winter, were taught how to farm the land by their new native friends. And as a gesture of goodwill, they invited the Wampanoag tribe to share their bounty. It's a heartwarming tale. But the reality is that this single isolated event has been plucked from its devastating context and polished into a national fairy tale. The peace it supposedly represents was temporary. The friendship was a political calculation, and the gratitude it symbolizes masks a history of theft, massacre, and cultural destruction. To understand the truth of 1621, you first have to understand the world the Pilgrims were stepping into. The land they called Plymouth was not an empty wilderness. It was Pequot, a village of the Wampanoag Nation, who had inhabited the region for more than 12,000 years. But by the time the Mayflower dropped anchor in 1620, that world had already been shattered. Between 1616 and 1619, a catastrophic plague, likely brought by European ships, swept through the coastal tribes. This great dying was an apocalypse. Entire villages were wiped out, with some communities losing up to 90% of their people. The Pilgrims didn't find a wilderness, they found a graveyard. The fields they would later plant were only available because the generations of people who had tended them were dead. The Wampanoag, led by their chief, Usamequin, were in a fragile position, threatened by rival tribes who had been spared by the plague. He was a shrewd political leader facing a crisis. He needed allies. And then, a ship full of strange, starving, and desperate people landed on the shores of one of his abandoned villages. And one of the most mythologized figures of this era is Squanto, the man we know as Squanto. In the kid's story, he's a magical helper who appears, already fluent in English. His real story is one of unimaginable trauma. Squanto was from Patuxet. Years before the Pilgrims arrived, he was kidnapped and sold into slavery in Spain. He eventually made his way to England, learned English, and managed to get back home, only to find his entire village gone. His help wasn't just simple kindness. It was the complex maneuvering of a survivor caught between two worlds, his own now lost forever. So, when some of the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims gathered in the autumn of 1621, it wasn't a spontaneous party. It was a diplomatic meeting, a strategic alliance born of mutual desperation. The main historical account comes from Pilgrim leader Edward Winslow. He writes that Usamequin arrived with some 90 men, that is nearly double the number of all the surviving Pilgrim men. This wasn't a casual dinner, it was a political summit and a clear display of power. The Wampanoag weren't invited in the way we think of a dinner guest. They showed up, armed, to check on the colonists they'd made a treaty with. The deer they contributed wasn't a potluck dish. It was a traditional diplomatic gift. This alliance was fragile and served the interests of both sides. The Pilgrims needed Wampanoag knowledge to survive. The Wampanoag needed the Pilgrims' firearms to re-establish their power. That peace of 1621 didn't last. It couldn't. The English colonists saw land as private property to be owned. As thousands of new settlers arrived, their towns pushed relentlessly into indigenous territories. The warmth of the 1621 feast quickly turned to hostility. And it wasn't long before that hostility exploded into war. The first major conflict was the Pequot War. In May 1637, English colonists surrounded the main Pequot village at Mystic and set it on fire. As hundreds of Pequot, mostly women, children, and the elderly, tried to flee, they were shot or forced back into the flames. In under an hour, up to 700 people were killed. Following this victory, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony declared an official Day of Thanksgiving, to celebrate the safe return of the soldiers. These days of thanks weren't about shared meals. They were celebrations of colonial conquest. Just one generation later, the peace with the Wampanoag themselves broke completely. Usamaquin's son, Metacom, known as King Philip, saw his people being stripped of their land and way of life. He formed an alliance of tribes in a last, desperate attempt to drive the English out. The resulting conflict, King Philip's War, was, in proportion to the population, arguably the deadliest war in American history. By the end, Metacom was dead, his head displayed on a pike in Plymouth for 25 years. His wife and son were sold into slavery. The power of the region's indigenous peoples was broken forever. This was the true bloody harvest of the seeds planted in 1620. So how did we end up with the gentle story of pilgrims and natives sharing turkey? For that, we have to jump forward about 200 years. In the middle of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln, urged on by editor Sarah Josepha Hale, declared Thanksgiving a national holiday to help unify a torn country. It was in this period that the story of the 1621 feast was resurrected and repurposed. The image of pilgrims and Native Americans sharing a peaceful meal was the perfect origin myth for a country trying to heal itself. It suggested America began with cooperation, not conquest. It was a sanitized, romantic version of history that erased the violence and glossed over the genocide. So, what does this all mean for us today? For millions of Native Americans, Thanksgiving is a national day of mourning. Every year since 1970, the United American Indians of New England gather in Plymouth to remember the genocide of their ancestors and their ongoing struggle for justice. Understanding this history isn't about feeling guilty or canceling a holiday. It's about being honest. It's about moving past a fairy tale and grappling with the complex and often brutal realities of our shared past. This process is sometimes called decolonizing Thanksgiving. It means challenging the false story and centering Indigenous voices. It means acknowledging that the food on our tables, turkey, corn, squash, are all foods indigenous to this land, cultivated by Native peoples for centuries. We can still gather with family. We can still be grateful. But we can do so with a deeper, more honest understanding of where we are and what it took to get here. The myth of Thanksgiving is comfortable. The truth is not. But it is only by facing that truth that we can ever hope to truly understand the country we live in. This history is complex, and for many, it's been intentionally hidden. If this video made you think, please consider sharing it. What are your thoughts on the Thanksgiving story and its hidden history? Let me know in the comments below. And for more deep dives into the histories they didn't teach you in school, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching.